How do you terrify an audience? Fear is something everyone feels, yet we all feel it in our own ways. It's probably the second hardest emotion to capture, right next to humour. Fear, when done right, can elevate your story and help us get invested into your world and its characters. Some examples of this are Nope, the whole slasher genre, and The Walking Dead. Speaking of a zombie show, I've been wanting to talk about this new mega hit zombie show for a while now, The Last of Us. Now, The Last of Us is pretty much a perfect adaptation, with it adapting the game faithfully without feeling pointless, and that alone is a fantastic accomplishment. However, something I feel the show does better than the game was establishing the terror in the start. What do I mean by this? Well, the show within the first episode, before the apocalypse starts, sets the perfect tone and feeling that will leave everyone terrified as the show continues on. We see the now iconic news scene, where we see a 70s show broadcast where they go into depth about the possibility of a fungus takeover. The scene is still, with a slow camera panning in closer and closer on the scientist's face, gradually and occasionally cutting back to the still crowd, who look lifeless, almost zombie-like. Fitting, isn't it? With lack of music and subtle imagery creating tension and panic as the scientists go further into depth on the subject. We feel we are being warned as an audience, and with the very real science and the vacant stare from the scientist to end on a blank, quiet screen leaves us with a sense of dread before the credits even opened. And that's what The Last of Us was fantastic at, to create a sense of uneasiness in the viewer without having to use any major forces to do it, such as the show Zombies. It follows the logic of slow and steady wins the race, to a T, and it goes to show that they know what they're doing behind the scenes. They understand not only the game, but how to expand upon it and grow it. There's a reason why this scene has stuck with people. The perfectly combined elements has already established the tone of the series going forward, and that tone is fear. But there's a scene I feel is incredibly underappreciated, in just how perfectly it was set up and terrifying to watch. The show follows the Shaun of the Dead approach, I'd like to say, where they do little visual and audio details in the background, just enough as to where you may not notice it at first. But when you do, you feel as if there's a countdown, like the end is approaching rapidly and all we can do is watch. It feels extremely real, since it may take us one or two times before we even notice that something's wrong. And fear works at its best when it feels real. It didn't have to be something that can't really happen, but needs to feel like you could be in that position too. Now, everything I have mentioned so far was simply the build-up alone, and considering that the build-up was able to leave us with dread and panic, goes to show that The Last of Us knows how to scare us. But what's build-up without payoff? Now, let's talk about that scene I said was underappreciated. The reveal scene. Essentially, in this scene, Joel's daughter is given a bread trail to follow, and since we haven't seen the effects as well, we are just as on edge as the characters. And this slow, handheld shot, leading us through the house as more things are brought into question. It perfectly uses ambiguity to draw us in and keep us there.
Mrs. Adler?
Ambiguity itself is terrifying, as probably the biggest thing everyone fears is the feeling of unknown. It's not what you know that scares you, it's what you don't know that scares you. And so when you see the blood that begins confusion in the audience, then we follow the blood to the neighbor struggling to breathe on the floor. replacing that confusion we had with panic. And then we finally pan the camera in a handheld-like way to the right to see the old woman feasting on the other woman, now replacing that panic with pure fear. This scene alone, even without the whole episode of build-up, perfectly terrifies us into being just as scared as the characters, and thus brought us into the world and the story, and left its impact on you, that you will remember it as you continue to watch the show. If a show can instill fear in you, it will ensure you remember it, and that's why this scene works so well. It's memorable. This is our first time seeing the zombies. And this is just one. I think this scene takes a lot of inspiration from slasher films, sort of like Friday the 13th, where we'll start to see slow build-ups of what the creature has done, or what the thing in question has done. We get little breadcrumbs that lead us further and further towards the truth. We see the massacre that they've left behind before we inevitably see the thing itself. This is how The Last of Us terrifies us. It uses key details, those details being dread, panic, believability, but the most important detail to keep this all together is time. How does time help here? Well, let me explain. All of the details I have mentioned of how The Last of Us perfectly uses fear wouldn't work if we didn't have the time. After all, if it threw it all at us in a single go, we wouldn't feel anything, as it would just be too fast, or too slow doesn't help as well, as by the time we actually get to the big reveal, the fear factor would have worn off. You have to find the perfect balance. First half of the first episode of The Last of Us uses that time to build up, slowly progressing and adding more details as it goes along. So by the point where at the end, we now have an almost complete picture. The Last of Us knows what it's doing with these devices, and I'm excited to see how the rest of the series does with it. Whether it expands upon it or not, I'll be sure to take a look at it. But the 4 devices that they've used, those devices is how we feel fear. Those devices are what keep us invested, not only in this world, but its characters. Those devices are how The Last of Us terrifies us.